Hello, everyone. I'm back to do another commentary for you. And at this point, we are looking at the chapter called Structure and Function in the book Organisms Through Movement by Moshe Feldenkrais. I already put out a couple videos where I actually read through the text of this chapter, so you can refer to that if you like. Now, I just have a couple of preliminary notes on this. First of all, in this chapter, Feldenkrais is, when he says structure, he's talking about, in particular, the structure of the human brain. And he's going to, in 1972, give his version of how the brain works, right? I think there's a lot that's been discovered about the brain and understood since then, which is probably a lot more sophisticated. And this is probably not the book you should use to start your study of the brain if that's something you want to go into deeply. I was asking a colleague of mine the other day about some of what he says in the chapter regarding the human brain, and there may be some question around these things. Secondly, on top of that, I'm not someone who's very steeped in neuroscience, cognitive science. Some of my colleagues have done quite a bit more of that. Of course, every Feldenkrais practitioner learns about neuroplasticity, and there's a number of books on the brain that I've read, but I'm not the kind of person who's really good at remembering all of the anatomy of the brain and, talking very technically in that way. So I just want to preface the discussion of the brain in this chapter in that way. But having said all that, I think what Feldenkrais does have to say, which is specifically about the relationship between thinking and action. And remember, he's already outlined for us in earlier chapters that there are 4 components to the waking state: thinking, sensing, feeling, and doing. So in particular, thinking and doing are looked at in this chapter, but also feeling, the emotional response that we have to the world. I'll have more to say about those relationships here and talking about what Feldenkrais brings forward. But in any case, I just want to say that as someone who, as I mentioned, has not done maybe deep reading on the anatomy and physiology of the human brain, but someone who has practiced the Feldenkrais method and who has experientially made use of this understanding of, essentially, you might just say, how we tick, as opposed to exactly what the brain function is. Feldenkrais's concept of what human brains were capable of was way ahead of his time. Again, I mentioned in a previous commentary the neuroscientist Norman Deutsch, who's in a recent book called Feldenkrais, one of the first neuroplasticians. So Feldenkrais was already very much acting on the assumption that the brain can reformulate new patterns and continue to learn and improve the overall quality of life of an individual long before other people really thought this was possible. So forgive me if there's some generality to this discussion in terms of the brain, but I think that a lot of the points that Feldenkrais brings forward are actually really crucial. And if you practice awareness through movement, or even if you think through these concepts more generally, just looking at your daily life, I think you'll see that there's a lot of these things that you can kind of test out. My experience has been that a lot of what he's talking about here really does check out with my experience, and in any case is a very helpful way of framing human learning, growth, and development. So the first point that Feldenkrais wants to make is that abstract thinking is something that humans do that's unique to our species, right? Animals are not engaged in abstract thought in the way that we are. So he's going to now talk about 3 levels of the brain. And so he's going to talk about the Rhinic system, the limbic system, and the supralimbic system. Now, if you don't want to deal with those terms, it's fine, but you can just think of it in terms of like levels of the brain. And so he begins with the Rhinic system, and he says, this is just the basic individual structure that any organism has to have to maintain its survival, self-maintenance. So that's just the basic level, right? Next up is the limbic system, and he says this is a second group of structures in the brain that deals with everything that concerns the outward expression of vital internal needs. The need to sustain the body and the Rhinic system creates internal drives that express themselves towards the environment. And this is what he's just going to refer to as instincts. So we have to deal with gravity. We have to deal with the fact that we get hungry and get thirsty. So that's acting out into the world, but it's just very basic in terms of our self-maintenance. He says all the marvels that we usually call instincts, such as the building of nests by birds, the spider's webs, and the ability of the bee and the pigeon to find their way home over great distances, they originate in these structures. Okay, so we have just the internal bodily function, like keeps the organism alive, and then there's some need to get something for the environment, again, to deal with things like gravity, to get nourishment in order to continue survival. But what's crucial that he points to here, and you can just think of evolutionary sort of process of adaptation as the environment changes, this is where learning begins. So let's say that a bird has to migrate because environmental changes, and they move to a new habitat, and suddenly what is available to build the nest, it's not the same materials the bird used to build the nest in the old habitat. So the bird that's going to actually survive and, you know, procreate and have ancestors, which is going to actually be the evolutionary link, there's some learning that has to go on. This is what he calls the dawn of the ability to learn. And he also just points out that there are individual differences. So when a baby is born, there's the instinct to suck the mother's breast. But for some infants, that's not kind of instantly there, and there has to be some stimulation. Maybe the mother brings the infant and brings his or her lips to her breast and sort of stimulates that, right? So there's a kind of a very basic thing that's there in the species that's an instinct, but there's still these individual differences. And again, the adaptation to new situations to still just fulfill those basic needs like nourishment, etc., that's where we begin to see how learning can take place. Okay, so humans, however, Feldenkrais is making the point, are capable of very fine differentiation. Now, of course, this is not to say that there aren't incredible sensitivities and coordinations, fine motor kind of things that all kinds of other species can do that we can't do. You mentioned the spider's web, right? So, but in particular, humans have very fine differentiation with the hands, right? So he mentions the skills of playing a musical instrument, drawing, or writing. You can just think about how those are all distinctively human activities that are not found in other species. And he also highlights the sensitivity of the mouth, the throat, and the breathing apparatus. And this phenomenon of hundreds, perhaps thousands of languages that have been created by humans. And of course, singing and whistling, he also mentions. But again, this very distinct ability to create particular movement patterns. And he doesn't discuss it here, but we can also point to human beings being bipedal. In other words, standing up on our hind legs and becoming, you know, having legs and arms in a way and moving through the world, which is completely different than other animals, which is another thing that sets us apart. And also, of course, the ability to make complex sound patterns, which evolves into language. Now, if you recall, in a previous section, when Feldenkrais was outlining that while there are these four different components of the waking state: movement, sensation, feeling, and thought, but he says, I'm most interested in movement in terms of getting inside the human sort of internal system in order to make change. And he emphasizes the use of the muscles over and over again. But he also says, look, if you have an emotion, something happens in the muscles. If there's a tiny little disturbance, something happens in the muscles. This changes the breathing. So he's highlighting all this. So it's just interesting to notice here, he's highlighting the muscular sensitivity of the human being and connecting it to all these things that humans can do, including things like drawing and speaking, which are in that realm that he said is unique to humans, which is the ability to deal with abstraction, right? Okay, so heredity provides the human, provides any organism with particular structures, right? Which he's outlining here. But then he makes this crucial point that learning comes through experience, and the structures themselves are developed through experience. So again, just think back to everything we've talked about before about the self-image that each one of us has and how that is formed through experience. Okay, so there's a little section that comes up next, which I think is the part where I'm not sure how much we want to rely on Feldenkrais for this. He starts talking about the asymmetry of the brain, and he makes a kind of a not very straightforward claim. He says it is assumed that this primary opposition between right and left is the basis of our concepts of opposites in general. I'm not, again, the best person to verify that claim or not, but that's one I would take with a little grain of salt. But he does make this really important point here when he talks about a sort of more primitive kind of thinking versus a more developed kind of thinking. And basically, he talks about a kind of, and he's just put forward this claim about opposites, right? But he says, you know, there's a sort of a basically like a black and white way of seeing things, or hot and cold, like everything is just one way or the other, a kind of a dual way of thinking. Or there is a more sophisticated way of looking at things where you understand, and he says, for example, the relationship between hot and cold is actually a pretty complicated thing. But in any case, he's saying that we're more than like an on-off switch, right? As we move up the evolutionary chain in terms of thinking. And something that Feldenkrais says many times elsewhere in his teaching, which I think is relevant here, is that he'll talk about freedom of choice as only existing when you have three options. In other words, if I just have yes and I have no, I like it, I don't like it, that kind of thinking, again, a kind of a dualistic way of putting things, I don't really have what he calls human choice. So he said famously many times, you need at least three options to have a human choice. That strikes me as maybe related to what he's bringing up here. So from here, Feldenkrais is going to begin to discuss the relationship between this kind of abstract ability to think that we have. You might just think of it as like the way that you talk to yourself all day in your head, right? Again, using language, which is an abstraction. You can say tree, and you can imagine a tree, but that's a pretty pretty abstract concept if we compare it with the tree itself, right? And how is that part of our experience related to the emotional centers, right? The limbic system, which is there to help us fulfill our needs, like escape danger, find food, those very basic things, those very basic drives and impulses. And he says that the connection between our supralimbic system, or the part of us that can do that abstract thinking, is to the emotions, it's a weak link. However, he says, if you have thought that is purely abstract, that has no connection to feeling, he says it's also not connected to reality. And I think that point is also worth slowing down on a little bit. This is just my riff, but he's talking about the dangers of just going into pure abstraction. And this is, I think, relevant to the discussion of our world today, what Professor John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis. You know, we're in a moment in time where people are increasingly disconnected from their bodies, especially during the pandemic, and just with the rise of the use of technology and social media. A lot of our interactions with each other are kind of like the one you're having with me now, right? I'm a guy on your screen talking, as opposed to, you know, that direct human contact. It's not been eliminated, but there's a way that the sort of messy experience of directly contacting each other or just interacting with the world. Think of ordering something from Amazon that arrives to your house the next day, as opposed to a hunter-gatherer needing to figure out what they need in their community and just going out in the world and figuring that out, you know, directly. So what does Feldenkrais do in his method? He uses the body, he uses embodiment as a way to wake up new possibility. So his warning about falling into pure abstraction, I think, is quite crucial here. And he said on a number of occasions that one of the things that he was most proud of in terms of his work was his ability to take something abstract and make it concrete. And if you get into practicing awareness through movement, you'll see that often you're doing a sequence of movements that, when you step back, is actually clarifying not only the use of your body, but something conceptual, which he's somehow managed to kind of make into an embodied metaphor for you to explore. Just back to the text, specifically, he makes the point that if we have a thought and we're trying to figure out, is this right? Or is this just some random thing I thought that I need to, you know, toss aside because it's not right at all? Well, how do we figure that out? We figure that out through experience, again, through our contact with the world, through the body. Okay, but back to this question of the relationship between thought and feeling and action, or in terms of how he's discussing it here, the supralimbic system and the limbic system and how we act in the world. So he said that the link between thought and feeling is somewhat weak. And what this translates into is that there's a bit of a time delay, right? So if we think back to the first structure of the brain, the Rhinic system, and then above that, the limbic system, which he's outlining in terms of that's the part of our brain that's really focused on just like dealing with those basic necessities, safety, food, etc. That system works fast, right? It really goes quickly. You may have heard the phrase used in popular culture these days, the lizard brain, right? So that's a way of talking about an earlier evolutionary structure. And people also talk about how if we don't slow ourselves down and we act from the lizard brain, that's, you know, like acting out of fear, acting out of pure emotion. And that's often when we do something later that we regret. So he says the delay between thought and action is the basis for awareness. And in a simpler way, he brings out the phrase, think first, act later. He says that's not just a phrase, that's actually a meaningful thing. So what happens is, let's say someone makes some comment about me, and to use another word that's very much in our culture these days, I get triggered by that, right? Well, that so-called triggering is a readiness. My muscles contract, I'm ready to do something. Let's just say I'm ready to fight, I'm ready to run away, or perhaps I'm the kind of person who freezes. But those are all animal responses, right, of what a prey does in the face of a predator, to fight, to flee, or to freeze, right? And that happens super fast. So, but then to think things through, like, oh, wait, that person made that comment about me, but actually this is not a life and death situation. That's bringing in the supralimbic system, right? That's bringing in this human structure of the brain. And he says it allows us to do some very important things. We can inhibit, right? I can catch myself and decide, maybe throwing a punch is not necessary in this situation, right? But I can catch that I was almost mobilizing to do that. Maybe I've begun to clench my fists and I can feel that. It's also, this delay is the basis of imagination and intellectual judgment. So in many of his awareness through movement lessons, Feldenkrais asks his students to imagine a movement before they do it. And this is sort of an intentional use of this thing where it's like, I think I'd like to get up and walk across the room. Now that thinking of doing it is beginning to mobilize myself to do it. But because thought is kind of slow, just thinking, it's only at one stage, but I can begin to like try on the idea of getting up and walking across the room. Maybe I think of getting up and then I think, no, I don't want to get up right now. I sort of feel something. So he's saying this is how we can imagine and make judgments. Like someone says, hey, do you want to go out for dinner tonight? I heard there's this new Italian place down the street and you might sort of try on eating Italian food. No, I don't think I'm in the mood, right? Finally, this delay between thought and action, he says, is the physical basis for awareness. So that's also just knowing what's happening with me right now. Am I in a state in my physical body that suggests a particular kind of action, maybe a kind of action related to survival? Or maybe do I realize, oh, everything's safe here. There's no need for me to mobilize to protect myself. And in fact, I can be just calm. I can have a nice breath, but it's my awareness of my state that can help me to make those connections explicitly in that part of my brain that is capable of abstract thought. And this can help me to sort of map out what's going on internally and use it for my benefit. Then we come to a section of the chapter called Doing Does Not Mean Knowing. And Feldenkrais makes the point, and I've mentioned it before, that we literally don't know how we do many things. And here he's going to use this example of how do you stand up from a chair. And as I mentioned, he's going to actually lead you through an exploration of standing up from a chair in one of the awareness through movement exercises in this book. He says, it is easy to demonstrate that man does not know what he is doing, right down to being unable to rise from a chair. He therefore has no choice but to return to his accustomed method, which is to give himself the order to get up and to leave it to the specialized organizations within himself to carry out the action as it pleases them, which means as he usually does. So this basic transition through space, right? I'm sitting, I need to stand up because I need to go somewhere. It's related to something very basic. And at a certain point early on in life, I learned how to do that. And so it's become a habit. It's kind of in that category of instinct, you might say. It's like, time to go, okay, stand up. And I just stand up however I stand up. But the actual way that I use my body to do this, and including if I do it efficiently or not, is not something that I consider. And then if I want to do it efficiently, I don't particularly know how that is unless I've studied it. And so this is precisely what Feldenkrais is going to do in his method, is he's going to take everyday actions. And even though there's this delay between thought and action, it's still very small, right? These things happen so quickly that usually we just sort of say to ourselves, all right, stand up, and then there I go, right? What he's going to do in awareness through movement lessons, he's going to take everyday movement and he's going to slow it way down, right? So often you're doing something like rolling on the ground or reaching or doing some movement, which is like a little element of walking, or all kinds of movements that he explored. But his basic strategy is to reduce the effort that you need to make, which is why you're often on the floor, lying down in one position or another, but also to slow you way down so that you begin to have the experience of tracking these things that unfold very quickly. Because how many different joints have to be involved to come from sitting in a chair to standing? Well, quite a number of them. And there has to be a particular coordination for it to be successful. And then to go beyond successful and actually be efficient, and to be an action that if you repeat it every day, it won't actually wear away your joints, but it will help you to move efficiently. It will be a kind of a good start to then walking efficiently down the street, something like that. That takes quite a lot more study. And so when he teaches the lessons, he's going to slow you way down. And then he's also going to ask you different questions as you move to bring your awareness to different relationships. And in this sit to stand lesson, he's actually going to, one of the directions is something along the lines of think about standing up and now stop and repeat that. In other words, think about standing and see what happens. Just think about it and see what happens. And you just the thought begins to do some little mobilization that you can begin to track. So this is a way that he is using this phenomenon of the delay between thought and action very specifically in his teaching. Okay, so just underlining this point again, he says, without awakened awareness, we perform what the older brain systems do in their own way, even though the intention to act came from the higher third system. So again, that might be standing up from a chair. I had a thought, I want to get up now, here I go. But then when I give the command, it's the older systems that just sort of do what they do. Moreover, the action often enough proves to be the exact opposite of the original intention. So again, with standing up from a chair, you've probably seen people do this all the time. You might do it yourself. What a lot of people do is they will put their hands on their thighs and they will push down as they're trying to stand up, which is literally like, it's like what you would do if you were trying to keep someone in their chair. You would push down on their thighs. So they're doing the exact opposite of the action that they need. Now, Feldenkrais has said before that every action has these four components, or we're always using these four components. So thinking, sensing, feeling, and doing. And in this particular section, he's not talking so much about sensing, that is, sensing the stimulus coming in, although it's very much part of it. But he says, the feeling part of us, that's faster, and it just comes online much more quickly. The thinking part, that's slower. And so when I perform an action, the part that is coming from my thinking, it often doesn't even really get out of the starting gates before the other parts of myself directed to feeling have already done their thing. And so he gives the example of a slip of the tongue, or you could think of someone losing their temper, right? It's like, well, I'm having the intention to stay calm, but then something happens, and before I know it, I'm already yelling and screaming, and I wasn't able to stop myself, right? Because the thinking part is just too slow in this case. And maybe a little bluntly says, hey, look, you don't actually need to be aware to live. There's plenty of things that you can accomplish without awareness. However, that's not recommended. And in fact, he points to awareness as being really, he thinks, the next stage of human evolution. Interestingly, he once said in his Amherst training, one of his American trainings, that he was thinking of writing another book. And of course, he never got to write this book. And I've heard different versions of the title, but it was something like The Skeleton and the Future of Consciousness. And we might talk more about the skeleton later, but one of the big pieces of what you'll find different about the Feldenkrais method, either if you see a practitioner who works with you individually or if you take an awareness through movement class, is that there is repeatedly this emphasis on paying attention to the skeletons, that is, your bones, What are you doing with your bones? And what is the relationship of your bones to gravity and all of the rest like that? He's already talked here a lot about the muscles, but just, you might say, phenomenologically, what he's often asking you to do is notice the bones. And so he's saying, hey, look, if the future of consciousness has something to do with this understanding of ourselves as this movable structure of bones. So highlighting again what he said in the chapter, awareness gives us the capacity for judgment, differentiation, generalization, the capacity for abstract thought, imagination, and much more. And at the very conclusion of his chapter, as he's again underlining the importance of awareness, not only for our well-being now, but as he sees it, the evolution of the species, he's going to tie this all back to what he's talked about many times already, which is the relationship of the individual to society. And just to sort of give a little more flesh onto that before I read you one of the last lines, all of this stuff about feeling and how it works so quickly, and how a lot of the times to really do what I want, I need to have the power of awareness to slow myself down and not just respond emotionally. Well, that's often coming in this sort of struggle of the individual with society, right? My self-image, you know, someone says something insulting to me, and it's not so much that my life is at danger, but if my social status is in danger, and, you know, that's going to affect my ability to make a living. And as he's talked about, my ability to make a living is going to affect my self-worth, which is going to affect my self-image and how I move through the world. So you can see that connection. And here's how he sums it up. Awareness of the relationship between these impulses and their origin in the formation of human culture offers man the potential means to direct his life, which few people have yet realized. So he's kind of underlining, look, we haven't really conquered our operating system that we all possess to the highest degree, such that we can use it more skillfully to navigate culture and, you know, these old evolutionary drives that are in us. But he's saying, look, it is possible. That's what awareness can do for us. Okay, so that is my take on the chapter Structure and Function, and more videos will be coming in this series soon. Once again, please leave your comments, your questions. I would love to hear what you think of this series. Again, I really hope you will get yourself a copy of Awareness Through Movement so you can read this directly and fill it with your underlinings, as I've done in this copy. And anyway, I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.